Welcome to a special edition of the i3 podcast, produced in partnership with the University of Technology of Sydney's Finance Department, which includes the Anchor Fund, an educational investment fund managing real money, which is run by students and overseen by Associate Professor of Finance Lorenzo Casavecchia of UTS. So this episode aligns with the second installment of the UTS Circle the Square sessions, which are a thought-provoking series of roundtables on economic, financial and political ideas. You can find them on YouTube, and of course i3 is very happy to support them. So today we will delve into the neoliberal model, which post-war has provided guardrails for economics to operate in and allow investors to focus on the usual numbers: earnings, inflation and growth. But these guardrails have been eroding under the influence of various forces, including the rise of populism. And this has led to an almost permanent state of uncertainty. And of course we all know markets don't like uncertainty. So how did we get here? What has changed? And why did a neoliberal model hold together for such a long time in the first place? So this episode sits a little bit outside of our usual investment talk. It's more about the system underneath the data, applied political economics, and we're asking why the guardrails that once held in place neoliberalism have been thinned out, and what is left behind. So, I'm joined here today with three panelists. So first off, we have Elizabeth Humphrys, who is the head of discipline for social and political sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. Elizabeth is a political economist who focuses on the impact of financial crises and climate change on labor relations. She is the author of the 2019 book How Labor Built Neoliberalism. We're also joined by geopolitical strategist Philip Ivanov. Philip has been globally recognized as an expert on international relations, particularly China and China-Russia relations. And he has worked in Russia, in China and the United States. So he will provide us with a global view on this issue. He's also an industry fellow at UTS. And finally, we've got Rob Prugue, who is an honorary industry lecturer at UTS, but who most of you probably know as the former CEO of Lazard Asset Management for the Asia-Pacific region. He's one of the driving forces behind the Circle the Square Roundtable series. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Wouter.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so we're looking at uncertainty in markets, which to a large extent has been caused by the dismantling of the guardrails in which the political debate have moved. Now, let's start at the beginning. What were those guardrails and what kept politics out of the market for such a long time?
I think the best way to explain this is it's nascent and where at least I see it began. And it probably began post-WW2. When the West in particular needed to rebuild itself after near a decade-long World War and the destruction that obviously it needed to be addressed, and having learned the lessons of previous mistakes such as League of Nations or working in a bilateral world, the West appreciated early on, in order to counter the Soviet force, it needed to unify. And as part of that, it needed to build a system that would rebuild an economy by lifting the ship rather than individually handing out life preservers and life jackets to sectors or worse, certain people. As a result, guardrails were built to make sure that this was a system that benefited the totality rather than specific groups. And over time, that worked well. This is not to suggest that neoliberalism didn't have its challenges. Of course, we had wars. Of course, we had economic cycles. Of course, we had large unemployment. But when you compare it to pre-1946, and the fact that, now the world had access to nuclear destruction, all things considered, neoliberalism, certainly post-WW2, had its benefits, and that peace brought a national prosperity. The guardrails were there not necessarily as instruments of curtailing growth, but think of it as golf rules. I'm not a golfer, but when you go out into golf, there's certain etiquette and rules that are applied. The guardrails have that, but then they built systems and infrastructure to, again, manage that. It's as simple as the World Bank, Bretton Woods, World Bank and IMF, the United Nations, at an international scope, the World Health Organization, to name but a few. But then progressively, even domestically, you had these guardrails. And that, despite its shortcomings relative to pre-1946 level, allowed the West to unite as a group, allowed the West the formation of NATO, the formation, again, of these other organizations. And that benefited many until it didn't.
Yep. Elizabeth, if we go to you, do you want to provide a little bit of a local flavor to that and put it in the context of the local labor policies?
Sure. I think for Australia and other what I'll call like highly industrialized countries, not so much like just what we would call the West, after the World War, there's this long period of growth, largely fueled by the rebuilding efforts in some ways after World War II. But that protracted period, like in my work and in political economy, we call the long boom, it sort of came to an end in the early 1970s with the oil shocks, issues around inflation and other sort of not just issues external to the economy, but perhaps contradictions within the economy that sort of came to the fore. And I would characterise that period as more taking its lead perhaps from Keynesianism. Like these bodies of policies are never implemented as in a textbook, right? They're contested, they're partial, they vary between countries. But the end of that period in the early 1970s, really for me, that's when neoliberalism starts to cohere, not just as an ideology, but as a political project that begins to be implemented in different countries. And it looks different in Thatcher's Britain, for example, or Ronald Reagan's US, to how it looks in Australia. And it's really only in 1983, with the election of the Bob Hawke government under the slogan "Bringing Australia Together," that we start to see some of the kind of like big bang economic reforms that we associate with neoliberalism, like floating the dollar, foreign banks being allowed into the country, reductions in tariffs, privatisation. These sort of all flow from then. But what's really important to understand is these things are not just about what the ideology of an individual political party is, but often who has the political capital to implement those policies at that time. So even though, of course, Fraser was much more conservative than Bob Hawke on a range of issues, he didn't really have the political capital. He was in a war with the unions to introduce the big reforms that were being called for via government inquiries. When Bob Hawke comes to the table, and that Bringing to Australia Together slogan, it's really to, the way I would term it, restore profitability of the system, that the rate of profit from investment needs to be restored, or accumulation needs to be restored. And Hawke says we have the answer, that in collaboration with the unions, who have been on the front foot in the 1970s, demanding a bigger share of the pie, a bigger share of GDP, going to workers' wages, vis-a-vis to profit. He says we can help deal with this unrest. And really that's the political context for me that sees this weird situation where we both get the advance of what we would call neoliberal policies that I mentioned a moment ago, but also at the same time, a return to centralised planning, centralised wage setting and bargaining with the support of some of industry. The Metal Trades Union, for example, the Metal Trades Industry body was really central, as was the Metal Trades Union, into bringing in this new kind of arrangements under the Hawke-Keating government, which of course, longest Labor or Social Democratic government, 13 years from 83 up until 1996.
Yeah. So if we then draw it to a global picture, and, Philip, I introduced you as an expert on China and Russia relations. Can we even talk about neoliberal guardrails in those countries? But also broader, how do you see the global perspective from that?
Yeah, well, I think from the end of the World War II, just drawing on what Rob told us, you have this dynamic of competition. So you have the two geopolitical blocks. You have the US-led system, and you have the Soviet Union and its allies. And then you have a whole group of non-aligned states. Now we call them kind of geopolitical swing states, using the Goldman Sachs sort of terminology. But back then they were called non-aligned. So the India and China can be in that category as well. Then U.S. creates the international institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. But it's institutions that are mainly built by the West, but right at the beginning, in the 1940s and 50s, there was a genuine desire for this institution to include everyone, including the Soviet Union. So this dynamics of competition and cooperation was still there. The non-aligned states, and particularly big ones like China and India, are quite weak and underdeveloped, so their role in the international system is really not that important. So it's really the world is dominated by these two rivals. And then as Soviet economy and political system starts entering stagnation in the 1970s, US-led bloc continued to prosper, and with that, the Bretton Woods institutions and the systems that we today discussing as neoliberal systems largely. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union enters into this period of deep, and as we now know, the final decline, and the US-led system thrived and prospered, and it enters its golden age, which is essentially 1980s and 1990s, the age of globalization. And, of course, it's uneven, it's unequal as for the rest of the world, but we see, by the 1980s, we see the sort of this golden age of US-led order, including the political order as well, which has elements of neoliberalism. So you have the globalization, both economic but also political and cultural. You have US strategic hegemony. Essentially, there's only one superpower. We have absolute primacy of the US dollar, of US culture to some extent, of the US economic systems and rules and structures. And then we start seeing the rise of China, but it's the rise that was back then seen as benign. The consensus was that China will become the United States, just like the United States or any other democratic nation, as its economy became a market economy. We had, from 1990s to about 2007, we have a stable and predictable Russia, that relatively benign, with a few exceptions. And then you have convergence of most states, including what used to be called non-aligned states in the 70s, around the US-led system, largely, with exception of maybe some countries like Afghanistan or Nicaragua. And then the rise of technologies as well, which played a big role in that convergence, the internet and then social media. So then that's kind of where we ended up by 2005 or so, when I think that order started to unravel. But I think that will be your next question.
Yes. So to what degree is this framework synonymous with, what people refer to as the peace dividend, Pax Americana, the great American peace? Is that all overlapping, or do you see this as a separate system?
Any government that swayed too far away, left or right, from the guardrails got penalized in the borrowing costs. So whether you're left or right, you had policies that you needed funded. some of these policies couldn't be self-funded through taxation. They needed to borrow money. And so there was a shared vested interests since basically much of the post-war period until the guardrails began to be dismantled. And within that dismantling of the guardrails, we now began to see certain sectors benefiting at the expense of the rest. And as that continued, we saw more and more disenfranchised.
Yep.
So the Rust Belt of the U.S., they felt the pain as the factories were being closed and moved to China. Australia used to have some manufacturing. Now we're mining and service, very little manufacturing. So you can see how this sort of morphed itself very slowly, one drop at a time, until that glass got full.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, if we take a domestic view at this, how did those guardrails sort of got eroded here? Because I think you tie it back in with some of the weakening of domestic institutions.
Yeah, I guess I come at neoliberalism in a more critical fashion. So when we're talking about the guardrails, the setting up of those guardrails or the setting up of frameworks was always contested in the first place. It's not like we can presume there's a shared interest even between unions and business or even within the corporate sector between finance and manufacturing, right? These things are always contested politically. So for me, I think we need to think globally that the implementation of neoliberalism had its antinomies. It had the negative things or the negative consequences. And some of this included from what I would call from below, right? So around 2000, we actually see the outbreak of mass social movements moving from the global south, Latin America, from the so-called IMF riots, the water wars in Bolivia, into the streets of Seattle and eventually into the streets of Melbourne, contesting the roles of things like the World Economic Forum, the World Bank. We've got to understand this is neoliberalism as contested in both its implementation and its sort of thinning, as we've been talking about. And the time frame this happens on in different countries varies. So, we bring up Russia and the Eastern European countries. Neoliberalism comes later in those contexts because of authoritarian rule before that. It comes later to the Mediterranean because we have Mussolini in Italy, we have Franco. Actually, neoliberalism is sort of not delayed, but it's on a different time frame. But the very fast implementation of neoliberalism in Eastern Europe means that the pain that people experience as ordinary workers is really, really sharp. It's on a protracted time frame. That the gap between the rich and the poor, so, we measure these in the Gini coefficient, this becomes drastic. And we get situations like, New Zealand before neoliberalism, it had a Labor government like Australia implemented in the 1980s. It's more equal than Australia. Australia is less an equal country. But actually neoliberalism there leads to New Zealand having a greater gap between the rich and the poor compared to Australia today. All of these things play out because they have social and political consequences. And I do agree, it's not like anybody came along with a plan about how to dismantle the sorts of structures that were built up in the 80s. But I think there's one important thing I always try and remember. Neoliberalism, as a sort of policy platform, argued that a greater amount of decision-making should be in the hands of markets as compared to in the hands of government. We understand this as the small state, lower taxes, deregulation, privatisation. But this is a shifting of responsibility for a range of decisions, even, floating the dollar into the hands of markets. This has a political consequence that when people in the Rust Belt start to experience the world as they're working harder than ever and getting far less. And, my dad at retirement, he was an oil refinery worker. So I experienced neoliberalism firsthand growing up in a working class family. They see their lot as undermined in that period. And so it's not just we can't take a sort of pathologized approach to why do these people look to populism, or why do people look to be dissatisfied with the political system or the financial structures. We've got to see it as their experience in the 80s and 90s led to dissatisfactions, which play out now politically. And so for me, it's not just about how corporate interests or particular interests in the more elite sections of society or in global supranational bodies like the IMF, World Bank, UN, even the ILO, right, which is a tripartite body between unions, government, and industry. These things aren't just contested there and understood politically and discussed there. They are discussed every day by people who used to work in manufacturing jobs, or like my dad and all his friends who worked at the Mobil refinery in Melbourne, which is now closed after decades and generations of families working there. This leads to a really sort of, for me, a confused way of understanding the consequences of neoliberalism. We can't just build back what used to be there. Decisions are made on both what policies are fit for purpose in the moment, which is why you can get people to look, the ALP in the 80s, to look to both Keynesianism and neoclassical economics at the same time. They're looking for policies that are fit for purpose. So it's no use having a kind of more paranoid, who's this group of people who are bringing us this new world order? For me, it's a bit conspiratorial. I actually think mostly people, governments, policymakers, business are looking in a self-interested way, sometimes in a national interest way, for what policies are fit for purpose. And to me, that's led to a thinning of policies in relation to what we understood as those classical, more hegemonic neoliberal ideas and policies, but also to the more hegemonic social democratic ideas that have existed through the long 20th century.
Yeah, and to what degree can we tie this back as well to globalization? Obviously, when globalization kicked off, there's a lot more challenges for people to keep manufacturing in their own economies. It goes to cheaper labor countries. That sows seeds for also dissatisfaction and ultimately rise of populism. To what degree can we tie that in this debate? And maybe, Philip, for you as well, the other part of it is the post sort of war guardrails. America was a dominating force at that time. Now we're living in a very different world where, as you indicated, China back then wasn't as big as it is now. We're living much more in a world where there's a multi-polar world where different forces have different influences that are all eating away at the previous system.
Well, we talked about the sort of economic guardrails. We talked about socio-economic or socio-political guardrails, but there's also geopolitical guardrails that were ignored, I think. And there are four, in my view, that are quite fundamental, particularly from the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was sort of four fundamental mistakes were made, I think, by the triumphant West. Number one is the idea of China as the factory of the world. That is, that it's always going to be benign, convergent power that will largely look at the West and will largely follow that path. I think it's been a fundamental mistake, as we're learning now. Number two is ignoring Russia as a declining power that's no longer important, no longer influential, that sort of can be ignored. That old thesis by some of the American policymakers that is, it's essentially a petrol station masquerading as a country. Bad mistake, in my view. Number three, taking for granted the rest of the world, including countries like India or countries of collective Middle East or Africa, thinking that they essentially are converging around globalization, which they have been until they stopped converging or until they looked elsewhere for alternative governance models or sources of growth or sources of equality. And then I think the fourth one is really ignoring the kind of fundamental historical forces of power, of nationalism, and of inequality. And I think inequality plays a big role in that unraveling, But also that nationalism, that idea that nationalism is no longer relevant and it only appears occasionally, around particular issues, which we know is not true. And, you look at the world now, it's very nationalist world. And the kind of the raw power dynamics are on display. It's the largest number of wars and conflicts at the moment than any time since the World War II. And, the inequality, apart from obviously economic inequality that we see around the world now, but it's that strategic and power inequality, is that there's a politics of strategic grievance. Who's reaping the benefits of the power and influence now. We see it in China. They call it the age of humiliation that they're trying to repair, and rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. That's how President Xi Jinping describes it. It's the sort of the top of the mountain. If you look at the world, we see it obviously in Russia. That the collapse of the Soviet Union, according to the Russian president, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of our time. So that politics of grievance caused by that perceived inequality of power, of economic wealth, of sort of influence and respect. I mean, that plays a big role. So I think there's these are both the guardrails that we as a collective West forgot to construct and to follow, but it's also, I think, some fundamental mistakes in collective policy making.
Yeah. So do we have a sense of where we are in this erosion of the guardrails? I mean, are we getting towards the end of an era? I mean, is the rise of populism and perhaps the second administration of Trump the culmination of this development, or are we somewhere in the middle?
As I've said before, I can't see how one can unscramble eggs. I think the divisive politics of today is well ingrained, so much so that even traditional parties, right now more so visible on the right than on the left, are being, it's almost like a hostile takeover by not necessarily an ideologically driven group, but to paraphrase Philip, the politics of grievance. So Philip correctly mentioned the politics of grievance as it relates from an international playing field, but domestically we have it here. Elizabeth touched on that as well, where certain groups felt left behind, and that even continued much further in the 90s and in 2000 with more of the regulatory guardrails, which were meant to be a leveling playing field. Because after all, even the IRS, the SEC in the U.S. are being pulled back. The Department of Education, it's almost, as I said earlier, government guardrails are equivalent or synonymous to bureaucracy now. And so how do we rebuild that? I don't think we can, because now at least we've gone to, at least with regards to the states, that it moves so drastically away from the systems that they themselves built and marketed globally, has been dismantled. So if you're outside the U.S., you now have to ask yourself, all right, we do a treaty. Will that treaty or that deal still be viable. And we see remnants of that here in Australia with regards to AUKUS and the submarines. As I think, I can't remember who it was, they correctly pointed out that there's a law in the US that they must fill their needs before they can sell it to others. That law and the US submarine fleet needs major rebuild. Probably means we're not going to get those submarines anywhere near the time frame that it's been sold. So I'm not saying that the submarine is it. I would hate for anyone to cherry pick what I said, but rather look at totality. And that is, can we go back given how massively the US has dismantled it even within its own borders?
Yeah. So what are the implications then for today? Are we, slowly heading towards total chaos? How do we deal with a post-certainty world?
Capitalism is more resilient than, I think, total chaos. But I know, like, progressives are very fond of that Gramsci quote about that when systems decay, these morbid symptoms appear when there's no kind of hegemonic order. And I do think it's kind of applicable to now, in that we had a sort of well understood and accepted form of social democratic government of different varieties. Not that US is not exactly social democratic, but it was sort of accepted, and there were consent from the masses, right, to put it in those terms, for those systems. We're not in that period anymore, right? The government legitimacy is at an all-time low in across the Anglosphere where we are. And then the point about global grievances is very well made, right? We live in with the consequences of colonialism that led to an unequal share of wealth and the extraction of wealth from certain geographies and its removal to others, and the build-up of wealth in what we would call the core. And it's not grievances about payback. It is grievances about wanting equality, justice, and a bigger share of the pie is how I look at it. And we should see that they're not just legitimate, but completely understandable. So that promise of neoliberalism that remember Thomas Freeman saying in 1996 that no two countries that have had a McDonald's have ever gone to war. Now, we know that this is clearly not the case, right? But that was a promise, right? A promise of a peaceful future from the neoliberal order. That trickle-down economics is a promise of something that is desired by the majority. And when they cannot be delivered because of the constraints of the system, I would argue, this plays out politically. So for me, there's this fascinating study done in the US around what I would call anti-politics and others might call populism, where they looked at they had interviewed people over multiple generations about all sorts of issues. They had this massive database of these interviews with ordinary UK people. And what they found in terms of politicians is that politicians have always sort of been on the nose, right? They've never been particularly loved. But the difference now, and Peter Mayer and other leading figures in the UK have said, is the difference is that the political system itself is on the nose now. This is the difference in the present period. And so actually the question of restoring faith in politics and in the Australian political system as well is a difficult question to solve when people feel that politicians are self-interested, that they are not from the ordinary people, that they don't represent them, that they're not trusted. This is a massive ball of difficulty in terms of policy making, right? So we get a situation, I think, where people generally want the playing field levelled in all sorts of ways, but can the system actually do this and maintain growth? We have in the wings a massive issue around climate change, environmental damage, and growth itself, with vested interests from certain sections, which are key in mining in Australia, who make massive profits with very few people employed in those industries. So there are choices to be made in Australia And I think potentially because of geopolitical needs, because of domestic profitability and growth needs, often those discussions about what the future could look like in terms of being equal, dealing with climate change, come into conflict with those other things. Like, I don't want to go out on a limb, but I don't think we'll ever see those submarines. The time frame might be never. But it for me, the heart of the problem is that promise of, in the domestic sense, that promise of the neoliberal future of trickle down, of bringing Australia together, as Hawke said, and the failure for that to eventuate still lives in the minds of people of my generation who grew up in the 70s, but my parents, and then, of course, young people now who see that they'll never make it into the housing market, right? And I don't mean the ones we teach at our uni in our courses, right, who come from much more middle class backgrounds, but the chances that your average person owns a house who's 20 today are actually really delayed, if ever. But I do think it's not just about selling bureaucracy. Governments still make choices. So, like, the housing discussion about how we will use the future fund to fund housing through investing and earning interest. This is a very different kettle of fish to a policy of just going and building public housing, right? Now, that is an ideological choice about who should do the building and who should own those properties. So there is still a live discussion, I think, and it's not about going backwards, but whether we actually want to say, yes, social housing, public housing can be built by governments with their expertise and owned by them in the future, rather than the private sector trying to solve this problem. So that issue of who's responsible for social policy, the market or governments, for me, this still persists. It doesn't often get a hearing in election time in those terms, but we can't go back. We can't unscramble the eggs in that way, but we actually can go forward in building a different set of policies through, I think, considered debate from all sections of society, you'd hope. Yeah,
it almost sounds like you're describing an era where we're moving beyond politics, where people no longer feel affinity with political parties, but more of an era where people are interested in particular interest groups or particular issues. Is that maybe where we see the rise of populism as sort of a disguise of the rise of special interest groups rather than politics as we knew it?
I think we have seen one fundamental change, that the political system that Gramsci was talking about when he was in jail under Mussolini in Italy, of mass membership political parties and mass membership trade unions, is over, right? Membership of the ALP, membership of the Liberal Party, these are at all-time lows. Membership of civil society organisations have been declining, and this has been well documented across the US. So, and the UK, most of actually Europe, not just the English-speaking parts. And so I wouldn't say necessarily it's a rise of special interests, but the old political order is seriously frayed, if not seriously damaged. Now, I think we don't see it as clearly in Australia because we have compulsory voting, but people voting has been going down. It may peak up at some point, but it is on a downward trend across Western Europe, across the Anglosphere. This is this disengagement from politics and seeing that your views might be represented in a parliament, because that's what not voting is, not thinking you have relevance or that you can impact. This is a really profound issue. And so when we put all that together, this kind of fraying of the political system, disenchantment, and outward hatred of the political class in some sections, right? You know, Trumpism is one example, Brexit is another, Palmer and his party here. There are lots of examples of the old ways of doing things, of a two-party system in this country being, you know, seriously undermined. primary votes for the major parties are at the lowest point historically in Australia today. That tells us something about where people see their interests as being represented. And if they don't find an avenue to feel represented, yes, then populism and more kind of anti-politics is, I think, one way that we see that play out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Philip, maybe you can add to that, because obviously, I think Trump is sort of the biggest symptom of the rise of this populism. Where do you see the fractures internationally?
Yeah, well, I think that with what we just discussed is also has sort of, it can be described maybe a little bit simplistically, and it's sort of across the 5 big trends. So number one, you have the economic fragmentation. And within each of this trend, I have to add, there's contradictions, there's tensions. So you have the economic fragmentation as sort of deglobalization, which is, again, debated and debatable, because within each of these movements of economic fragmentation, we see some contradictions. For example, there is a push for sovereign capabilities or deindustrialization, but at the same time, this economic independency or codependency still exists, is still very strong. Then the second big trend is the major power competition, particularly US-China, but also Russia against the West. But even within this, rivalry still coexist with dependency. And I think the US-China relationship is a perfect example of that. Then you have the societal divisions that Elizabeth talked about. Despite the growing wealth, let's say across most of the Western world, there are these grievances, there are cultural divisions, there are political divisions, religious, etc. And then you have the two sort of underlying trends. One is climate change, again, which is a really divisive trend, because on the one hand, it's a global shared problem, but there are politics of grievances and inequality that play a big role. Who has to pay for fixing the climate change impacts and issues that are associated with climate change? And then, of course, the technological revolution. Again, you have this incredible connectivity. The whole world is converged. Even the poorest countries, everybody is on the internet. Everybody is now going to be a part of that. Well, not everybody, but most countries will be a part of that AI ecosystem. But there are divisions, there's inequalities. So we have these 5 big trends converging at the same time in this very compressed period of time. But each of them, we don't even have an agreement on their direction, on their trajectory. So each has this contradictory forces within them, and so it creates this sort of really uncertain environment. And I think this is probably the best way to describe it. With the period that we are now is some kind of transition. And the question is, well, not so much a question, but I think we do have agency. What comes after? We shouldn't be so sort of pessimistic and passive that these trends would necessarily result in, let's say, a major war or a climate catastrophe or some kind of societal collapse. We as countries, and each country, each government, we have agency in how the next decade will be shaped. And I think that kind of that message often gets lost. Because we are so focused on uncertainty, so focused on reacting to this wave of shocks and issues. But we have the opportunity to shape it, what the next decades will look like. But it doesn't. It's not the message that I think people hear from the political leaders. Going back to what Elizabeth said. And so it creates a certain degree of pessimism and passivity, I guess. And maybe that is one of the explanations of why people don't vote or don't participate in civil society institutions, or that might explain tribalism either on the internet or in real life, because the people feel that they don't have agency to shape what the next period should look like, including their own life, because they think that these big trends, these big shocks are just so overwhelming, and they see their government don't have a coherent vision to shape it.
Yeah. Rob?
To me, the greatest threat as an investor, I would pose it in a term that I like to use, political convexity. That in the era of Pax Americana, even through disruptions, there was a path. And the markets knew what that path was. As we started breaking away from that path, we brought in uncertainty. Initially, the market accepted that, but now the market is jumping much more quickly at any shock than was visible in the past. Some of that may be, as Philip mentioned, international. Some of it may be domestic, as Elizabeth mentioned. As someone who grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s, I could see much of these transitions, and I was there at the end of the Vietnam War. I was there when the U.S. went off the gold standard. I was there doing Watergate. I was there doing the U.S. embassy in Iran. So I could, as a young adult or a child, I could see that. But now, as touched by Elizabeth, this grievances, there was at least a safety net of some sort, a perceived or otherwise, but there was a safety net. Now, I don't think people think there is a safety net, and so is when what I call the resource belt. Hear about the move towards COP50 or the push towards solar panels or even the push towards EV. It's kind of laughable that it's not a debate between Holden versus Ford. It's a debate between combustion and greenies. That's just incoherent. I don't understand that kind of debate. It's we've turned politics almost into religion, where if you challenge my thoughts, you are challenging my beliefs, and therefore you're an enemy. And you're seeing that playing out brilliantly in the divided conservative movement here in Australia between what I would briefly call the city conservatives and the resource conservatives. And within certainly the resource conservatives, this disenfranchised, these people who no longer feel they have agency, they will listen to whoever promises them. And you'll note that they don't necessarily challenge them anymore. We used to. In Elizabeth's father's era, in my father's era, we challenged our politicians. We didn't just take what they said for granted. Sure, there was an alliance, and sure, there was a certain level of belief, but we were willing to challenge the politicians. Now, you don't see that. And as a result, you see in this morphing of populism rise up on empty rhetoric and selling scapegoatism. And you're hearing it because they don't talk about their vision, they just talk about what's wrong. And they make the person feel heard. And that is a huge political pull for someone who feels they have no agency. As a Latino, I remember, I call this ping pong politics, where you go far right, far left, far right, far left. And although in Peru we have 5-year terms, not 4-year terms, a little bit longer, in the last 6 presidents, 5 of them are in jail.
Okay.
And not always because of corruption's fabricated or real. It's like, I'm going to get rid of you so you won't come back and dismantle what I'm building. So it's a democratic coup of sorts. Yep. Where not a coup of military, but a coup of ideology and empty rhetoric. And that's why I have grave concerns of the rise of the populism, and no one on the left should be dancing with joy that the liberals are being divided in two. Because in that vacuum will be filled. And I'd rather at least have an understanding where, who's managing that vacuum than handing it over to empty rhetoric.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. I guess on the point on technology, the sort of often we hear about its destructive role, particularly in division in our society across religious or cultural, political lines. But I think we overestimate in its role. It's definitely a very powerful amplifier of political divisions or major power competition. Any of these trends that I mentioned, technology is a big amplifier and a big factor. But we're humans are driving these trends first and foremost. These trends are not driven by technology. Technology is a tool. It's a very powerful one, and then we're about to learn how powerful artificial intelligence is as a tool, because that takes all that technological revolution to the whole new level, because it plays with cognition, with reasoning. It's something that we have, at the moment at least, little understanding and little control of. But the role of technology should always be discussed in the context of the role of humans, first and foremost. It can't be discussed as a sort of a separate issue that kind of exists in its own universe and drives its own trends and shapes and influences how societies and nations work. No, it's not like that. It's our tool. We created it, we shape it, and now we've created a new one that we're still learning about, and probably will be learning for generations to come. But I think that taking it to the kind of the world of geopolitics, it is a powerful factor in the way that countries now look at each other, and we know that the technological competition is essentially at the heart of the tensions between the two superpowers that we have now, United States and China. It's really, the tension is not about the land. The tension is not really about ideology, but the tension is about who controls the future. And who controls the resources and technologies to control the future. And so, the U.S.-China competition is first and foremost a technological competition, then geopolitical competition.
Yeah. So talking about the future, we're in a period of transition. It's not really clear where we're going or what the next system will be. But do we have a sense of where potentially the new guardrails will come from?
For me, look, that is $1 million question, and I will try to take a stab, if I may, and say I could see three things forming at once. Firstly, a more nationalistic approach to the world. Australia first, America first. More self-serving interests driving it. Then, as the guardrails have been dismantled and left a vacuum, my concern is that vacuum will be filled by oligarchistic approach. In Australia, the mining, in the U.S., the broligarchs, what's called the tech leaders, where self-serving interests will take that role to fill that was previously done by other government departments, perhaps, or influence it or drive it. And then from a global political point of view, from a multilateral world to a bilateral, unilateral world, where I could see three blocks forming: the U.S., Europe, and the BRICS, where you have three economic powers right there, and how the three will intermingle, how the three will work together. Will the EU come as they did under the Plaza Accord or the Louvre Accord? I doubt it. Possible, but I doubt it. And all these things, when you look at it, the totality means that there's greater uncertainty. And greater uncertainty means that the dividends from the Pax Americana are gone.
Yep. Elizabeth, do you want to contribute to that? Where could potentially guardrails come from in Australia? Are we just going to have a dominance of mining industries?
There's not much of a future if we're only relying on that. But I think politicians are aware of that, right? Like, we've had a century of politicians being aware that Australia is too dominant on primary industries and resource extraction, but it's not been able to resolve that policy, either through the Keynesian long boom or through the neoliberal era. There are tensions particular to the Australian economy that I'm not confident that the politicians even know how to address. My expertise is not in what guardrails give confidence to international markets. So I'll leave that to you guys to sort of respond to. My thinking is always about can governments or political sectors lead national projects that cohere and bring justice. We don't just want coherent projects that trample over minorities. We want these projects that take us forward. For me, that Accord era of Hawke and Keating was the last time there was a truly kind of grand national attempt to have this project that would address those contradictions of the Australian economy at that point, replan industry, give labour a fair share, protect its wages in a high inflation environment. Success or not, or criticism or not aside, I'm just saying that lack of vision, we've lived with for 30 plus years. And so when we look at politicians now whose horizons are quite low, who they talk about like the small target strategy in elections, none of this gives me much confidence. And also we just got to remember it's not always just about the individual politician who goes down in the history books. It's often about sections of society, what I would call a social base. Right? The social base of the unions gave the Labor Party its power through that long 20th century. That's gone. What social base, what large groups in society are going to lead to secure futures? I'm not sure where that is. And just on climate change, of course, it's never about fossil fuels versus greenies. Renewable energy is itself a profit-making possibility, right? And I think that markets understand this, right? But often we're having this debate about so-and-so versus so-and-so. For me, my research is about how climate change and its heat is a massive OHS problem for the future, which the insurers are concerned about, politicians barely on their radar. There's a lot of hidden things, but hidden profit making in this. So really, this is a war between people who want to make profits from renewables and people who want to make profits from fossil fuels. But we don't often really talk about it in those terms. We're talking about tree huggers versus multinational oil
rev heads. Rev heads. Yeah. But Elizabeth, aren't you also concerned that you talked about the base? Isn't it also possible that there's a new base forming that is the disgruntled, those who are left out, those who have been disenfranchised, and therefore that they're going to be, and the populists who are let's face it, opportunists. They're not ideological driven. They're opportunists. They will tap into that, make promises.
Absolutely. You've not read my work, but you're you're in the vibe of it. Like, the thing is, there is a vacuum, it will be filled. And what I see, anti-politics, or you're calling populism, creates an environment that is not of the left or the right. People then, individuals or political parties, try and capitalise on that. So we can have both Trump in the US and Syriza in Greece, or Podemos, the mass movement out of the Progressive Square protests in Spain. It is not automatic that it goes to the left or the right. And these are, but the problem for these individual politicians or political parties is if they cannot deliver on their promises, this just leads to often their quick ousting, right? Now, Trump has survived longer than most, promising things to the Rust Belt, but then barely delivering. These tensions can't be papered over forever. And so part of, I think, the contestation in the US is because Trump can't deliver on the populist promise of those which he was first elected. And now this has led into a much more racialized kind of policy framework and punitive policy framework that we see in the current era. Sometimes I think that even the geopolitics is about managing the domestic internal contradictions and problems that Trump has. But I just reject an approach that really sees the problems as lying with an individual figure like Trump. So the people want to say Trump's crazy or pathologize him or pathologize his voters as being, those articles, people who vote for Trump have a 10-point lower IQ. This gets us nowhere, right? They're less educated. They are voting out of their interests, their life experience, and who they're hoping can realise a different future. And in that sense, every voter in the US, here, any other country is up for grabs in a period of turmoil. And I think we want civil society organisations, politicians, and just generally community leaders as trying to map out paths economically and socially that take us forward. And there's nothing automatic about that, to my mind.
You want to respond to that?
I one point I would add to that is media.
Yeah.
So we may have algorithm and social network, but we have politically divided media as well. On the one hand, you have the right of News Corp or Channel 9, and then on the left you have The Guardian, or in the U.S. of course you have Fox News on one side and MSNBC on the other. And this has happened for a long time in the UK. It's now spread throughout the world. But all these things, and again, make it the vacuum is getting larger and larger. And Elizabeth raised a really valuable point. At the end of the day, someone's going to fill it, and if it's filled with someone without a unified vision, then this turmoil will just continue. This divisive world of us versus them will just continue to burrow in, and from, I guess, a market point of view, continue to drive this uncertainty.
So we end up there with a lot of questions. We never promised any answers.
No.
We just try to describe sort of the movement from that post-war neoliberalism to where we are now, which is a almost permanent state of uncertainty. But hopefully we've given you something to think about. So with that, I would like to thank Rob, Philip, and of course Elizabeth as well. Thank you very much for this debate.
Thank you, Wouter.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.